Without a miracle, I will still praise you. For you are God alone. You are God, reigning in majesty. Lord, you reign. King of authority. You are God all alone. You are God.
So Kergate Market, this was home to an abattoir and meat market where David worked. David also worked in Bradford, and when back in Leeds, he worked as a hod carrier on a building site and then at the wholesale meat market, which was next to Kergate Market. David also worked in several factories at print works over in the industrial side of Leeds. In the autumn of 1951, coming back to Leeds after a period in Sheffield, in April 1961, he was released from Menston Hospital and went back to live at 209 Bellevue Road. Worked as a labourer at Story, Evans and Co., which is possibly in Bradford. He worked at West Yorkshire Foundry in Leeds 10. He was sacked soon afterwards for fighting with another worker. In September 1962, back in Leeds again after a spell in Sheffield and London, his African friends were married by then. Slim and Tex, his friends, saw him from time to time and described him as nervous, twitchy, slow, shuffling, laughing for no reason, gone simple, in their words. They accredited it to the blow to his head by a police truncheon in King Edward Street, as said. The ECT and Lagactil in Menston also no doubt contributed to his plight, and there was no due care for mental health in the community then. Much further up the road, North Street in Leeds 2, in the 1960s, David was seen sleeping in what was known as Jews Park, or Sheeny Park, or Rubens Park on North Street, close to the city centre. It acquired these hostile titles because it was much used by the Eastern European Jews who had been refugees in Leeds from the 1870s and had started working, and in some cases living, around North Street in the early 1900s. It is now called Lovell Park, but notoriously, in 1917, there were anti-Jewish riots, which continued for 2 days when hundreds of Tommy Robinsons decided to take action against a perceived communist takeover, which was promoted by Leeds, fueled, I should say, by local papers, including the Leeds Mercury, which in the previous centuries had promoted the abolition of slavery and other progressive sentiments. Another area, Woodhouse Moor, Leeds 2. On the 21st of September 1962, David was arrested by PC Harold Robinson after almost biting off the finger of the park ranger. He was sentenced to 6 months for malicious wounding. He was sent to Hull Prison. Other addresses associated with David include Bellevue Road, as mentioned. In 1952, David was living here. On the electoral roll, his name was listed as Olu Davies. He lived there with Whitey, Isiaka, Harding, nicknamed Tex, and Sunday Daniel, who were both from Lagos. David also lived in Chapeltown, 15 Mexborough Avenue, for several months, and drank in local places. St. Albans Place is an address which was mentioned before, and David squatted on and off at 12 St. Albans Place, which was close to the Merrion Centre. But in November 1965, he was charged with malicious wounding of 2 policemen who caught him entering 12 St. Albans Place. His friend Abby Stowe, thriving ceramic business, was nearby, and Abby did his best to support David. And then, of course, there's High Royds Hospital, Menston. On the 11th of November 1965, remember, David was first instituted in 1953 for 8 years, so he had been released by then. On the 11th of November 1965, he was detained under Section 60 of the Mental Health Act and placed in High Royds Hospital, which was previously called Menston Asylum. Dr. Carty said he soon settled down, becoming less aggressive and overactive, but remained elated, garrulous, and somewhat childish. He was there again for 18 months. On the 27th of April, 1967, he was discharged. And Dr. Carty said he was quiet and cooperative. His hallucinations had faded, and his persecutory ideas had mainly gone. September 1967, David was back in Armley Prison. We have explored non-chronologically snapshots of David's life in Leeds through city centre sites and made reference to other places of relevance. We are now going to visit a site of his final moments in life.
If you gave me a reason, Lord, I will praise you. Without a reason, I will still praise you. If you gave me a miracle, yes, I will praise you. Without a miracle, I will still praise you. For you are God alone, you are God.
As we gather here, we know that the water was very important to trade. And Leeds and Liverpool Canal was built specifically to gather in the goods of the empire. The thing about talking about tragedies and tragic narratives with Africans is that most of the narratives tend to be tragic. And so a lot of young people don't want to engage with Black history for that reason. It's like, you know what I mean, there's nothing there for me, you know what I mean? So we do have to bring into play those narratives that have been intentionally excluded. And Dr. Martin Delaney, who coined the phrase Africa for Africans, to give a sense of homeland, that Africans had somewhere to call home. He devised a plan in 1860 after an expedition to Africa from America. He brought that plan of returning Africans to Africa to grow cotton. In 1861, he spoke at the White Cloth Hall, and the hall was packed full of Yorkshire industrialists who approved his plan. And it's just weird to think of a black man speaking in 1861 and being approved by Yorkshire industrialists. But his plan was thwarted when the American Civil War started. Lincoln promoted him to the highest ranking officer, black officer in America. He was a field officer. So we need to bring those narratives into play to counterbalance the story of Leeds as well as other places. We're jumping to the court case. Bramhope, Leeds 16, on the 7th of August 1968, Police Inspector Elliker and Sergeant Kitching picked David up in the city centre and drove nearly 6 miles north, dumping him around 3 a.m. outside the Fox and Hounds pub in Bramhope. They told him to knock on the door and ask for a cup of tea. From 1967, the 2 police officers involved in the hounding of David, Elliker and Kitching, demanded they were called each time David was found sleeping rough. On one occasion, on the 11th of August, 1968, Elliker and Kitching dragged David from his sleeping in the city centre and drove him 4 miles south of the city, dumping him in Middleton Woods. They said he'd feel at home there, in the jungle. But David always came back to the city centre. On the 26th of January, 1969, his final year, David was arrested by Kitching in the city centre. He was sentenced to another 14 days in Armley Prison. Based on witness testimony, this is believed to be the spot where David entered the water.
Mommy water, mommy water. I know your game, mommy water. Who would dare to tame a mommy water? Do you know the whereabouts of David Oluwale? Is he now your flame, mommy water? Mommy water. When David went out dancing, sampling the nightlife, did he catch your fancy? Are you now his wife? I know the way you function. Seduction is your goal. Did you snatch David have you claimed his soul?
Kitching told the inquiry where David tried to sleep. The transcript of Chief Superintendent John Perkins' first interview with Sergeant Kitching was read out in court. Kitching said, "I have put him, David, out of doorways and kicked his behind, under Leeds Library in Commercial Street, Grills, Bond Street, in Baker's in Trinity Street, in John Peters in the Head Row, Bridal House in Head Row, Empire Arcade, Briggate, Trinity Church, Boar Lane." Kitching used other chilling phrases, including, "Tickled him with me boot, never hit him really hard, kicked him gently, just a slap, booted his backside out of it, a good slapping." He said David Oluwale was a wild animal, not a human being. Evidence was taken from David Condon, a bus conductor, who saw in the early hours of the morning of 18th of April 1969 a short, scruffy man being pursued by two police officers down an alley off Call Lane, close to the Leeds Bridge. It was dark, and he couldn't identify Elika or Kitching, and he couldn't say if the short man was black or white. The alley could be Pitfall Street or Riverside Court. At the time, this area was called Warehouse Hill. For obvious reasons, you can see remnants of warehouses where goods from all over the world were stored.
I know the way you function. Seduction is your goal. Did you snatch David? Have you claimed his soul? When you love, you don't let go, Mami Water. I've learnt this much from those who know, Mami Water. If Oluwale lives with you in your blissful lair, remember those he left behind, Mami Water. Show us that you care.
On the 4th of May 1969, David's body, found at Knobstrups Weir at the junction of River Aire and the Aire Calder Canal by a group of boys including Wayne Batley and Martin Thorpe. If, as we believe, Elika and Kitching forced David into the River Aire near Leeds Bridge on the 18th of April, his body had drifted about 2.5 miles down to the weir on the way back to Hull. Ironically, before the Leeds and Liverpool Canal was built to access transatlantic markets, including goods from slave plantations, Liverpool was just a small fishing village, and Leeds a small woolen market town that traded goods through the River Aire and Calder system, where goods were traded into international markets from Hull to places such as Holland and Germany, but also Portugal and Spain, and their lucrative slave economies. Goods that Leeds relied on, including palm oil, mahogany, and other exotic goods from Nigeria and other hot countries, would arrive in Hull and be sent to Leeds, where the terminus of their journey would be where David's body was found.
Mami Water, Mami Water. I know your game, Mami Water. Who would dare to tame Mami Water? Do you know the whereabouts of David Oluwale? Is he now your flame, Mami Water? Mami Water.
Reigning in majesty, Lord, you reign. King of authority, authority. You were God all alone. You were God alone.
At the trial of Ellicott and Kitching, the two officers accused of his manslaughter, here's a sample of what was said. Phil Ratcliffe, working in the Central Charge Office at Millgarth, said, "I have never seen a man crying so much and never utter a sound," as Kitching pushed his knee into David's back at the charge counter. David, he said, was placid, far from violent. He was withdrawn and subdued. Hazel Ratcliffe, also a police officer, witnessed an attack on David on 26th of January 1969. He was punched to the ground and kicked so hard that he was lifted a little. He was holding his private parts with both his hands and he was crying, she said. WPC Hazel Dolby, PC Ruddock and Sergeant Frank Atkinson all described the brutal beating of David on several occasions by Ellicott and Kitching in Millgarth. But it was police cadet Gary Galvin who first suspected that Ellicott and Kitching were the instigators of David's drowning in the river. His fellow cadet, Brian Topp, had witnessed violence by Kitching against an arrested man and discussed this with Gary. Gary had heard rumors about David's last encounter with Kitching and Ellicott. He told Sergeant McLeod. Gary Galvin's son, Chief Inspector Carl Galvin, told Max Farrer that McLeod told Gary to think it over before he took his suspicions any further. Gary thought it over and told Inspector Jim Bass. Bass took it to higher levels, and inquiries by Detective Chief Inspector Len Shakeshaft then began. These are honorable officers. They saw wrongdoings and they did something about it. A Leeds policeman called Alex Williams contacted Carol Phillips, the Leeds writer, to say, "I saw him, David Oluwale, quite a lot. He never ran away from me. He wouldn't enter into a conversation with a policeman. He wouldn't talk, but he didn't run away. Whereas, if he saw Ellicott and Kitching, he would run, and he would shout, but he wouldn't run from me." From the 17th of April to 4th of July 1968, David was accommodated at the Church Army Hostel in the Calls, where we've just passed through. The former hostel took in homeless men with nowhere else to go, but unfortunately, David was turned away due to the color of his skin. On 4th of June 1969, David was buried after a welfare funeral in Killingbeck Cemetery, maintained by the Catholic Diocese of Leeds. Some of us were there yesterday to pay our respects. The plaque on his grave reads, "David Oluwale, 4th of May, 1969. The service was conducted by Father Martin Carroll from St. Anne's Cathedral in Leeds City Centre near the Leeds Museum." David Oluwale received a Roman Catholic burial and is buried with 9 other men in a pauper's grave.
I can find enjoyment, employment in the land of my dreams. I can find enjoyment, employment in the land of my dreams.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you
Thank
can
you.
stay, you're very
Thank you.
welcome, but we understand you've got many things to do. It might be worth mentioning that David slept in that doorway there behind you as well. So you're right on one of his sleeping places.
Yeah.
So it's a very appropriate place to end.
Great.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.